There were many German individuals and groups opposed to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime in Germany were involved in active resistance. It is estimated that 800,000 Germans were arrested by the Nazis and thousands of Germans were executed for resistance activities against the Nazi regime.
Sophie Magdalena Scholl, a girl who resisted Hitler and the Nazis. She was born on 9th May 1921 in Vochtenberg, Weimar Republic, to an upper-middle-class family. She was the fourth of 6 children. Sophie, along with her 5 brothers and sisters, Inge, Hans, Elisabeth, and Werner, were raised in a Lutheran family in which Christian values were important. She loved spending time in nature, reading and painting. Her father, Robert Scholl, was mayor of Vochtenberg in the northeast state of Baden-Württemberg. In 1930, when Sophie was 10, the family moved to Ludwigsburg, and then 2 years later to Ulm, where her father worked as tax consultant. Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933. Sophie, along with most of her siblings, was enthusiastic and supported the Nazi Party. Like many other young Germans, at the age of 12, she joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, BDM, the League of German Girls, and eventually became a group leader of the BDM. Her brother Hans Scholl joined the party's Hitler Youth movement. Their parents, especially her father, Robert Scholl, did not like their children's participation in Nazi youth groups. Her father was a staunch opponent of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party from the beginning. But soon her brother Hans, who had once eagerly participated in the Hitler Youth program, became completely disillusioned with the Nazi Party. Sophie was very close to Hans and also became disillusioned with Adolf Hitler and began to question the policies of the Nazi government. They had been disappointed by the reality of living in the Nazi Germany. They saw that no one could read what they wanted to or sing certain songs. Jewish classmates had to leave school. During a group trip, a 15-year-old girl said, "Everything would be fine, but this thing about the Jews is something I just can't swallow." The troop leader assured that Hitler knew what he was doing, and that for the sake of the greater good, we would have to accept certain difficult and incomprehensible things. But some girls were not satisfied with this answer. Teachers who did not support the Nazi Party had been sacked. Teachers had to pretend to be Nazis to keep their jobs, because most of the teachers had families which depend on them. Hans Scholl and some of his friends decided to form their own youth organization. This organization shared and promoted a love of nature, outdoor adventure, music, art, and the literature of German Romanticism. Originally seen by many as compatible with Nazi ideology, these alternative groups gradually dissolved and were finally banned by 1936. Hans remained active in one such group. After 6 months of national labor service, Hans was drafted into the German army. Hans always loved horses, and he volunteered and was accepted into a cavalry unit in 1937. However, a few months later, Hans was arrested by the Gestapo along with his other siblings, Sophie, Inge, and Werner Scholl, in 1937 for participating in activities that were not part of the Hitler Youth program. Gestapo was the Nazi Germany secret police. Sophie was released the same day, Inge and Werner a week later. Hans was eventually released after his commanding officer assured the police that Hans was a good and loyal soldier. This arrest left a strong impression on Sophie and began the process that eventually turned her from happy supporter of the Nazi Party to active resistance fighter. On September 1, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and 2 days later France and Britain declared war on Germany. The Scholl brothers were sent to fight on the front. As time went on, Sophie became increasingly disillusioned with the Nazis. Elisabeth Scholl recalls a conversation with Sophie. On the day before England declared war in 1939, Elizabeth said, "Hope there will be no war." And Sophie said, "Yes, I hope there will be. Hopefully someone will stand up to Hitler." When Nazi Germany began Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, her brother and boyfriend Fritz Hartnagel were sent to fight on the Eastern Front. During their time in Poland and the Soviet Union, they witnessed many atrocities being committed by the German army. Several events changed Sophie, including her father Robert Scholl's arrest by the Gestapo in August 1942 for speaking out against Hitler at work. Hartnagel reports of war crimes committed by Nazis on the Eastern Front, mass deportations, killings of Jews and Soviet prisoners of war being shot in a mass grave. She completed her high school in the spring of 1940 and wanted to study biology and philosophy. To gain admission, a student had to work for a period of time for the state in the National Labor Service. She began an apprenticeship to become a kindergarten teacher. She chose this job in the hope that it would be recognized as an alternative service in the National Labor Service, a condition for admission to university. This did not happen, and in 1941 she began a 6-month stint in auxiliary war service as a nursery teacher in Bamberg. After 6 months in the National Labor Service, in May 1942 she enrolled at the University of Munich to study biology and philosophy. Her brother, Hans Scholl, fought in France in 1940, but was allowed to study medicine at the University of Munich. Hans befriended other students who were initially drawn together by a shared love of art, music, literature, philosophy, but also questioned the principles and policies of the Nazi regime. They eventually adopted a strategy of passive resistance towards the Nazis by writing and publishing leaflets that called for the toppling of National Socialism, forming an anti-Nazi group called the White Rose in 1942. Sophie learned of the White Rose leaflets. Her brother and friends told her about the White Rose group and their resistance campaign, and she decided to join them. They were just 6 members of the White Rose group, originally founded by Sophie's brother Hans Scholl and his friend Alexander Schmorell. They were joined by Sophie, Christoph Probst and Willi Graf, and by one of their professors, Kurt Huber. They printed and distributed leaflets denouncing the murder of Jewish people, encouraging citizens to resist the Nazi regime and demanding an end to the war. They published and distributed 6 leaflets. The group published its 6th and final leaflet in early 1943.
The German name is forever damaged if the German youth doesn't finally rise up.
On February 18, 1943, Sophie and Hans Scholl arrived at the main building of the University of Munich with a suitcase full of leaflets, and dropped copies of the leaflets from the top floor into the entrance hall for students to find as they left the lecture room. The university maintenance man, Jacob Schmidt, a member of the Nazi Party, saw them dropping the leaflets and reported it to the Gestapo. Hans and Sophie Scholl were both arrested by the Gestapo. The police found handwritten draft of a 7th leaflet, written by Christoph Probst, in the possession of Hans Scholl. Hans tried to destroy the draft by tearing it apart and trying to swallow it. The Gestapo recovered enough of it and were able to match the handwriting, which led to the arrest of Christoph Probst. After interrogation, they were all charged with treason. The main Gestapo interrogator was Robert Moore, who initially thought Sophie was innocent. However, after Hans had confessed, Sophie takes full responsibility in an attempt to protect the other members of the White Rose. On February 22, 1943, before Judge Roland Freisler in the People's Court, Scholl was recorded as saying, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare express themselves as we did." On 22 February 1943, Sophie Scholl, Hans Scholl, and Christoph Probst were found guilty of treason and condemned to death. They were all beheaded by guillotine on the same day in Munich Stadelheim prison. Prison officials were impressed by the condemned prisoners' bravery and let them smoke cigarettes together before they were executed.
After the execution, a pro-Nazi rally was held at their university. Jacob Schmidt, who had reported them, was given a standing ovation. After the end of the war, Jacob Schmidt was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp.
Sophie Scholl is a symbol of resistance against Nazi Germany.
Our channel, The Past Quest. We only post videos about history. Subscribe the channel and support us. Thank you for watching.